And I'd go so far as to say that unless we rediscover the sacred, we will never avoid the downfall, the destruction of our civilization. I mean, Solzhenitsyn repeatedly said that the reason such terrible things had happened in his lifetime in the society where he was in Soviet Russia was that, as he said, men have forgotten God.
Hello and welcome back to Creed and Culture. It's a real joy to have Dr. Iain McGilchrist with us on the show today. Iain, how are you doing today?
Very well, and thank you very much, Luke, for arranging this interview.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate your time. Are you speaking to us from your house on the Isle of Skye?
On the Isle of Skye, where we've had snow for 2 days, so I'm not going anywhere, which is marvellous.
I've never been. I'm a huge fan of the mountains, and I've never been, but I've heard the Isle of Skye is just breathtaking. So I'll have to get up sometime.
I think so. Yes. It sounds to me as though you're from the Emerald Isle.
This is true. Yep. I'm a Northern Irishman, and
Northern Irishman.
Yes, Northern Irish. Yeah. I love the mountains over there, but never been to Skye.
Quite. No.
So,
no.
Iain has had an enormously impressive career. He was a fellow at All Souls at Oxford University, where he taught literature, and then he trained in medicine, which is, I guess, quite an unusual career step, but a fascinating one. And he went on then to work as a psychiatrist for many years. And then in his writing, he's brought together this interest, as I understand it, this interest in literature and this interest in the mind. Perhaps his most famous book is The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And he's got other works out, I think 2 volumes of The Matter of Things in the last couple of years. So it's a real honor to have Iain on the show. He's had a lot to say about, not only about the brain and about how we understand the world that we're based in, that a lot of religious people have engaged with, but also with what's going on in wider culture. So perhaps to kick us off, Iain, could you give us sort of a brief introduction to sort of, I guess, the main thesis, perhaps of The Master and His Emissary, but perhaps also sort of the main thesis of your life's work, if that would be a fair description of it?
Yes. Well, my very first book in my 20s was called Against Criticism, which was about the problems that I felt were endemic in the business of approaching works of art, in this case, works of literature, which was that we took something that was unique, embodied and implicit, and turned it into something that was general in nature, disembodied and explicit, and thereby destroyed the power and the meaning of it. And I felt there was something wrong with the way in which we excluded all except the most abstract kind of cognition. And I have always been essentially interested in ideas, and went to, while I was at All Souls, I had freedom to do what I liked. So I went to the philosophers' seminars on the mind-body relationship and so on. Basically found them too disembodied and felt I needed to do this in a more embodied way, which basically meant training in medicine, beginning at the grand old age of 28. And I did that and went into neurology for a short while, and to the Maudsley, where I was a psychiatrist with a particular interest in neurology. So that's where we were. And the thesis of The Master and His Emissary is continuous, if you like, with my earlier interests, because one day while I was there, I heard a colleague, John Cutting, talking about hemisphere differences, particularly about the role of the right hemisphere, which I'd heard very little about in medical school. Everything seemed to be reliant on the left hemisphere, which did all the heavy lifting. This turns out to be a terrible travesty, as I discovered as I explored the area. But essentially, what he'd done is spent 20, 30 years looking at and listening to patients with right hemisphere damage, not left hemisphere damage, and discovered that, in fact, this was more devastating than left hemisphere damage, even though with left hemisphere damage, most people lose their capacity to speak. And for those that are right-handed, they've lost control of their dominant arm. So quite important, but it turns out to be much harder to rehabilitate people after a right hemisphere stroke. Why is that? Well, they see the world in two different ways. And this has an origin that goes back really as far as we know in any animals that have neuronal complexes, the ancestors of brains. They're already asymmetrical. This is fascinating. And as they turn into brains, they're divided. Why? I think effectively this is because all creatures have to solve a problem, which is that of being able to get stuff, to grab their prey, to pick up whatever it is they need, to manipulate the world, or just to get stuff. And this is essential to survival. But equally essential to survival is watching out for predators, looking out for your kin, tending your offspring and your mate. And so you require two kinds of attention. One very narrow beam targeted on a detail that you already know you need, and another quite the opposite, not in any way given to what it will find, keeping an open mind, a very broad one, a sustained vigilant attention. And this effectively leads to two kinds of world, one in which there is a lot of fragments, these little bits that we know what they are and we need them and we can get them. But it has no meaning or structure, this world. It's made just of little bits. It's fragmentary. The bits are disembodied. They're decontextualized. They're abstract. They have no individual quality. They're just members of categories. And the whole thing is inanimate, effectively. Rather machine-like, importantly. And the right hemisphere, meanwhile, lets us see a quite different world in which everything is interconnected and flowing. Nothing is ever completely static or completely known. It is always developing, evolving. A lot of its value and a lot of what it is communicating is implicit, cannot be put directly into language of the kind that we use every day, at any rate. And this is a much subtler kind of knowledge, which means that we understand what another person means when they say something, what they're probably thinking. We understand tone of voice, humor. We understand sarcasm. The left hemisphere, meanwhile, is taking everything completely literally, as if it were a computer that had been given a syntax and given a lexicon and was putting the meaning together. And in effect, that is one of the differences, that the left hemisphere sees bits that it must put together in order to have a map of the world, whereas the right hemisphere sees that we don't need to put things together because they're already connected deeply, and they have meaning which is much greater than anything that can be in the map. So the map, the left hemisphere's map, is useful, but it doesn't contain most of what is worth knowing about in the world. For that, we need the right hemisphere. And my contention in The Master and His Emissary, having unpacked the neurology and the philosophical consequences of this, was that in the modern world, we see things more and more only the way the left hemisphere would make them, as if they were mechanical, as if they could be reduced to the parts and then we'd know all about them. And as if, in effect, they were a two-dimensional construct, a sort of schema of the world, not the world itself. And so I looked in the last half of The Master and His Emissary over the history of Western thought, over the history of ideas in the West, and saw that effectively 3 times a civilization had started very well balanced between these 2 points of view, each enriching the other. And this would be in early Greece, in the early foundations of Rome, and in perhaps the Renaissance in the West later. And then after a few hundred years, each of them drifted further and further towards the view of the left, hierarchical, rigid, schematic, bureaucratic, involved in grabbing power and sustaining power, but actually losing the civilization, which eventually collapsed. So that's it in a nutshell. And in my more recent book, which is the matter with things, I took this further by exploring how we can know that anything is true. It's a long journey, which is why it's a long book. But those who've read it have written to me and responded with extraordinary enthusiasm and kindness. I've tried to show how we can discriminate between things that are more likely to be true than others.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that summary. Now, I remember listening to you in an interview, and you said that one of, if not the most common response you get to your work is people say, you put into words something that I've known to be true but couldn't articulate, or something like that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's one of the commonest responses. And
I'd read The Master and Mystery before I saw that interview, and as soon as you said that, I said, that's how I felt. That's how I felt. So it had a really, I read it about 5 years ago, and a really big influence on me in particular. So my training is in philosophy and theology. Right. For the most part in the analytic tradition. I did my doctorate at Oxford, and I think that's valuable. I think
yes,
writing clearly and logical analysis is valuable, but I'd always struggled to understand how stories and music, in particular for me, but for others, the visual arts, etc., sort of fit into that, and you just articulated a way of understanding how they can complement each other, and indeed how stories and music in some sense can be more profound than what we can communicate in propositions. That had a huge effect on me. And I guess, someone might be listening and say, well, I'm not a neuroscience. I don't know whether what he's saying about the brain is true. But my sense is I'm not a neuroscience either, but you can accept that general point in terms of this distinction between what we make explicit in language and that which is contained within stories and music and visual arts that we cannot put into language. There's something there that even if you're unsure about the neuroscience, you could still grab hold of that. Am I right?
Yes, I think that is right. On the whole, the world unfortunately divides into people who are familiar with the sciences, who love the science in my work and have no quarrel with it, but then you apply it to society. I don't see how that could possibly be right. Then you get other people who love the philosophical, historical part of the work and say, well, I don't really know about the neuroscience. I mean, perhaps I just have to not care too much and take your word for it, which is fine. But for me, the excitement is seeing that these ideas are rooted in the very business of our brain. And in fact, one of the reasons we've been aware of them is that people who've taken the trouble deeply to introspect on experience have intuited for probably thousands of years that there is some kind of a difference or a conflict between two ways of attending to the world. And so the big revelation to me was attention makes all the difference, how you attend. If you attend with a clinically detached view, looking at details to build up a picture, you see one thing. But if you look at the world in a different way, which is more holistic, if you like, then all kinds of other things come forward. And one of the things I've noticed in my reading in the last 20, 30 years is that all over the world, in India, in China, in Japan, in the North American native people, in the writings of the traditions, not the writings of the Inuit, in many, many traditions, what I'm talking about is encapsulated in stories, but it's mind-bogglingly accurate. They've really got hold of the important distinction. And the way in which these two ways of looking at the world relate to one another. Because an important point to put in here is that the left hemisphere is less intelligent than the right. That surprises people. They may be prepared for the fact that it is less emotionally and socially intelligent, which it undoubtedly is, but it's also cognitively less intelligent. It perceives less, it attends to less, and it's more prone to delusion. In fact, delusions and strange denials of reality are far, far, far commoner when the person has to rely only on their left hemisphere and they have damage to the right hemisphere than when it's the other way around. So that's very important because, like a lot of not very intelligent entities, the left hemisphere thinks it knows everything. Effectively, the more you think you know everything, the less you probably know. And the left hemisphere knows just a few things. It's very familiar with those. It's very good at working with them. And it's a helpful servant, but it's a very poor master, something that actually Einstein is said to have said. So there we are.
Brilliant. Yeah. Someone who drew on your work is a woman called Eleanor Stump, who's a professor in America. And she wrote a book actually on suffering, but she started off by distinguishing between what she called Dominican knowledge and Franciscan knowledge. And Dominican knowledge is obviously going to be associated with Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican, and it's of that sort of left brain propositional sort. We're talking about arguments, logic, what we can make explicit, whereas Franciscan knowledge is more about what's implicit, that we can intuit, etc., etc. I thought that was quite helpful, maybe for our viewers and listeners, a sort of distinction between sort of Aquinas the logician and St. Francis the poet. Is sort of one way of thinking about this. So someone trained as a theologian, obviously a big guy that we have is C.S. Lewis. And when I reflect on your work, I think to some extent C.S. Lewis, although he obviously didn't read the book, he's caught what you're saying, because on the one hand you have a work like Mere Christianity, which outlines a lot of the doctrines of the Christian church, and there is a beauty to it. So he pays attention not just to the content but to form as well. He writes well. But on the other hand, he writes the Narnia Chronicles, so he appreciates stories. And I think part of the reason that C.S. Lewis was the phenomenon that he was is because he combined both.
Absolutely.
And arguably, in fact, Jordan Peterson is doing the same, because Jordan has the scientific background. He's got the sort of philosophical background, but there's also the sort of deep religious and attention to stories. That first book of his, Maps of Meaning, was all about myths. And again, partly I wonder whether that's why Jordan is so popular. So do you think figures like Lewis and if you like Jordan as well are onto something there? And are they exemplifying what you're after, or is Lewis not going far enough in the sense that he still places quite a lot of confidence in language when he's writing his Mere Christianity, etc.?
Yes, I need to sort of qualify the understanding of what it is I'm saying. I'm a great fan of clarity. I'm a great fan of using language carefully. And one of the things that people often comment on is how clearly I write about very difficult things and how much pain I take to help people understand what I'm saying. So I'm a believer in clarity as far as clarity can go, but no further than that. And and I'm also, language is my medium. It's what I write in, what I think in, what I talk in. I'm not a painter. I'm not a composer, alas. I've written occasional poems. But poetry is the way in which we use language in a way to subvert the weaknesses of language. It goes beyond. The reason it's not prose is that it is evoking all sorts of things subtly many things at the same time that ramify, that are implicit, and creating a much richer kind of way of thinking than just a word equals a thought and just putting them together like we're building Lego. So what myths and fables and the great narratives, and I think the Narnia books is an example of a great, or are a great example of a good narrative. I remember reading it to my children, and they were absolutely riveted by the story. And as I was reading it, I was thinking such profound theology. But no, I'm a great believer in logic and reason, and I'm a scientist, so I value these things. In fact, if anything, I believe nowadays we undervalue reason and science. I think reason is under attack from people who would want us to believe a lot of things that I think are extremely hard to defend. And science is under attack now, even for, not being politically correct or something like this. No, I'm sorry. I think that is not a path I would want to go down. I think science is a very valuable touchstone. And if we jettison it, what are we left with? Science is not a modern invention. Science has been something that has been done in all civilizations since the very start. The very earliest Greeks were, amongst other things, they were poets and playwrights and philosophers, but they were also scientists. So science is, I hold the candle for science and for reason, but what I dislike is the idea that science and reason can tell us everything, because they simply can't. There are plenty of things that are beyond either science or reason or language. And that's why we have things like poetry and stories and music and so on, which take us to a realm beyond the immediate understanding of a piece of prose.
Yes, I'm completely on board with that. I guess when I was reading your book, when I was reading the section on Heidegger, I was reading it, and because that goes almost a step further, because I'm on board with form matters as well as content. In other words, how you write and speak matters as much as what you write and speak. And I'm on board with the value of stories and visual art and music. And I think I'm persuaded that they're probably more valuable than the sort of academic work I do. But then Heidegger goes a step further. For our viewers and listeners who aren't aware, Heidegger was a German philosopher, and he wrote in a manner that many find very difficult to understand. And when I was reading it, I was like, do I need to become Heidegger? Is that, to what extent are you urging us to, I guess, to go that far, to move to the point where what we write is really, some would say, impenetrable, unless, I guess, you do a PhD in it or something. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we all need to become Heidegger, no. My admiration for Heidegger is high, but knows bounds as well. One of the things people have said to me now and again after reading The Master and His Emissary is, thank you for what you have to say about Heidegger. I'd never really understood Heidegger, but after reading what you've got to say, I see what it is that he was getting at. I may have therefore completely misunderstood Heidegger in making him comprehensible, but I don't think so. I think he's on record as saying he deliberately obfuscated. And his reasoning was that if you make everything too clear, people don't really get the full experience of it. It's the analogy I think of is like if you've been driven a route by car a number of times, you know it in a sort of way. But when you've had to drive it yourself, then you know it in a different way. You really know it. And I think what he's getting at is that there's a kind of glib way in which one can make deep things seem easy to grasp and in the process lose something. In my view, Lewis is so beautifully clear in his writing. I have such admiration for him for many, many reasons. But one is the beautiful clarity with which he writes. But I think one of the reasons that he's not thought of with the same kind of academic respect is that he wrote children's books, but B, that he is so very clear. He writes about things that are quite subtle, and when you read them, you go, well, that's obvious. And so in a way, he's taken away the difficulty of getting there. So you just think, see what I mean? So anyway, Heidegger aside, I think the phenomenological philosophers are deeply important. So for me, to an extent Husserl, to an extent Heidegger, to a greater extent Merleau-Ponty, and to an even greater extent Max Scheler, have been very, very important in my intellectual development. And interesting, these were people who are not much spoken about in Oxford.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I was actually speaking to a mutual friend of ours last night, James Orr, who's been on Creed and Culture, and he's doing a bit of work on that, on the phenomenologists at the moment. So I'll have to read his book when it comes out. But thank you for those thoughts. Now, I'm aware my girlfriend tells me, look, try not to make your questions too nerdy. So I realized I was pretty nerdy last time. So we're going to draw back. Okay, I'm going to become much less nerdy, and we're going to talk about sort of final section about an interview you gave about a year and a half ago to David Fuller from Rebel Wisdom, because we've been considering sort of the underlying, your underlying thesis, but we want to think now a bit about society. So in this interview, you communicated that you think society is heading in a bad direction. You've already hinted at that when you spoke about the sciences, and the attack on the sciences has been politically incorrect. I think you had in mind cancel culture, that sort of thing. And I think you suggested we need to wake up and do something about that. So what are these causes, I guess briefly again, what are the causes for decline you see in wider society? And what have you noticed since that interview a year and a half ago? Are there any causes for hope, or are you pessimistic?
Yes, I mean, I don't claim at any point that knowing about the way the brain works gives us a cause for things. The brain doesn't direct our civilization, our culture, or anything of the kind. It's responsive to that culture and civilization, which will change it in some ways. And it, of course, changes the culture in turn. But it's a sort of an encounter, a synergy, a kind of not a one-way directional causation. So in the situation we're in now, there should be many causes, and there are geopolitical, economic, many kinds of causation that a historian would point to. But what I'm pointing to is that there is one overarching way of looking at it, which helps to draw things together and explain why this is not going to work. and that is where hemisphere theory can help us understand what we're experiencing. So I think what we're going through is something that's been dubbed the meta crisis, which is to say it's not just a crisis in that we're destroying the natural world, not just that we're extinguishing species, not just that we're driving to extinction indigenous peoples and their ways of life, not just that there is an epidemic of depression, of ill health of all kinds, not just that there is fragmentation of society and people at one another's throats. What is happening is a polarization, a simplification, a desire for black and white categories, a disembodiment of the way we think, a refusal of empathy, of tolerance and kindness in the way in which we talk to one another. There's a fixation on greed, on what can be got either by a corporation, a government, or by an individual. But generally, this is the this is the outcome of listening to the world as conceived by the left hemisphere, where it is simply a lump of stuff. And there is stuff there that is useful to us. And it's that we need to get hold of. And from an evolutionary point of view, the left hemisphere has evolved to get stuff. It's the hemisphere of manipulation. And this is why civilizations destroy themselves. They overreach themselves. They get more and more. They want more and more power. They want more and more resource. They want more and more control. And it's this lust for control rather than nourishing a kind of intelligent freedom. It's this lust for power rather than the flourishing of creativity that is dragging us down to a place where we become more and more machine-like. There's a terrific imposition of the idea of the machine and the fact of the machine in life since I wrote The Master and His Emissary. Some people say the last chapter of that book, in which I looked at what might happen if the left hemisphere took over, was prescient, because that's exactly what has happened. To be honest, I was describing the world as I saw it then, so it wasn't that prescient. But in any case, this is the way in which things are drifting. And the point here is that while it's necessary to have piecemeal solutions to piecemeal problems, that will never do in the long run, because it's only with a change in the way we think about ourselves and the world and how the two of us relate that will bring about healing. Unless we achieve that, we'll just carry on being the same anxious, narcissistic, unfulfilled, greedy, resentful, entitled people that we are. Instead, we should practice a way of being which has more modesty, more realism in a way about what we can know and what we can do, a greater sense of empathy and compassion for one another, and a greater sense of wonderment and awe at the world, not feeling, oh, we understand it all. It's just a machine. We can do what we like with it. I mean, this is wrong on so many counts, and it's the way we think now. So that's really what I'm saying, is that if you really want to understand what's happened, it's not just that we were doing fine. Everything was going well, and then suddenly somebody pointed out that the weather was changing. And somebody said, species are going extinct. And somebody else said, why are there such rabid wars going on in society between groups that used to get on rather well together? When I was growing up, men and women weren't at one another's throats, the races weren't at one another's throats, but now they are. Is this an improvement? Is it better now that we're much, much unhappier than we were 30, 40 years ago? I mean, we've got the data on this. We know that it's not an artifact of diagnosis. We've got records of the way people reported their lives and their answers to questionnaires going back, nearly 100 years. And we know that people have got systematically more unhappy, more unsettled, and more directionless. So it's that we're losing and that we're missing.
So, I mean, there's so much there to really make it practical. You give two examples there, sort of men and women are at each other's throats and the races are at each other's throats. Take the gender issue. So what is going wrong, particularly with the gender issue, the mistrust between the sexes? And how practically might that be attended to?
Well, it's too big a question, really, for me to give a glib answer.
Yeah.
All I can say is that a little more finesse in our understanding of things, a little less sense of self-righteousness on both sides, and an acknowledgement that men and women have different strengths. I'm not denying to anybody of either sex the right to do and the ability to do many, many things. Don't misunderstand me, but there are things that just make us unhappy if we deny them, I think. And men are asked in a way to deny their masculinity and women to deny their femininity. Both of these are seen as somehow relics of an old-fashioned way of thinking, but I'm not so sure is all I'd say.
And just finally, so I can make the link for our viewers and listeners, so to take that practical example, and I realize that's obviously an enormous question. But then
question.
I know exactly, you could write another volume of Matter of Things on it, the gender volume. But
I will never write.
So then how can we bring together your thesis about the right versus left, these different ways of attending to the world, explicit versus implicit? Is there a way to link that into this very practical example of the sort of the war of the sexes?
Well, I'd be loath to try and fit it to that. I mean, in a way, it's just something I said because it's undeniably a matter of observation for somebody who's in their 70s. The happiest couples I know are of a generation that are now dying out. They had relatively long marriages. They learnt to fit with one another and tolerate one another and love one another. And the happiest and kindest and most generous relationships between men and women that I know are amongst people who are now dying out. And, there we are. I mean, it's just a matter of observation. I'm not saying right or wrong here. And maybe it's inevitable that we all have to, vie with one another and compete with one another and hate one another for being who we are. But I doubt the wisdom of it completely.
Okay. Well, let me just go at it a slightly different way and say, okay, what can the takeaway be? There's all this chaos in wider society. I'm in agreement with you on a lot of that. So what if because I don't want to, I know you're careful to talk about causality, but what could the takeaway, because one takeaway could be something like this: we need to see the whole as well as the parts. We need to pay more attention to these right hemisphere ways of attending to the world. We need to re-enchant the world. We need to rediscover sort of the religious element of life through attending to stories and the great music and the great visual art of the West. And as we do that, that will help fill out the picture. I mean, is that the sort of thing
I think that's after? I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think that's exactly right. And I'd go so far as to say that unless we rediscover the sacred, we will never avoid the downfall, the destruction of our civilization. I mean, Solzhenitsyn repeatedly said that the reason such terrible things had happened in his lifetime in the society where he was in Soviet Russia was that, as he said, men have forgotten God. And for many people, that word God is a problem. That's why I was very careful in talking about the sacred in the final chapter of The Matter with Things, a very long, I mean, it's a book-length chapter on how to understand the divine and the sacred, and to try and explain to people that it doesn't mean believing in an old man sitting on a cloud and embracing 6 impossible things before breakfast, but is more about a wise disposition of oneself towards a cosmos that is rich and complex beyond our full comprehension. And that seems to point to certain elements that we would otherwise ignore. It seems to have a purpose. I mean, these are all huge questions that would require seminars over a week, not 5 minutes. That's the difficulty. But I do think that is very, very important. And I sympathize entirely with people who say, oh, that's all rubbish. It's terrible old stuff. I can't bear people talking about God and things like that. Look, I understand that. And I take that into account in the way I write about it. But I hope, from what people say, I have succeeded in helping people see that there is something very important there, that it's about a whole vision of humanity and the cosmos. It's not about we must do more of this. I mean, I can say things about educational policy. I can say things about the natural world and what we need to protect it. All of that is in a way clear. It's clear what we need to do. It's less clear exactly how to achieve it. But that's in a way doing what the left hemisphere wants, which is to come back to something that I can have on my agenda. So I need to do this and this and this, and then everything will be fine. Well, no, everything won't be fine unless we fundamentally have a change in here. But the good news is that we can begin it by changing the bit we know about, which is what goes on in here. People always say, but I'm so small, the world's so big. And the world is so small in relation to the cosmos. Well, this is the left hemisphere thinking that importance is measurable, but it isn't. You are very important, and there are things you can do that only you can do that can change the way in which you understand the world, and that will change the world. If you get enough people to change the way they think, feel, and see the world, that will produce the change in perhaps not so long that is required, as well as having, I understand the necessity of the practical tasks, as people would call them. But there's nothing impractical about changing your heart and mind. In fact, it's necessary for our salvation and for your happiness and fulfillment as a human being.
It's interesting on that point. Did you come across Iain Ali's recent announcement about her conversion?
I heard about it, actually, just probably yesterday or the day before. Tell me more.
Well, it's fascinating because for our viewers and listeners, Iain Ali wrote, what was the name of the book? I can't remember the name of the book, but basically it was a book about her experience in a fundamentalist Islamic society and how she got free from that. So she got free from that and she came to Amsterdam and then eventually to the United States. And she was one of the new atheists. So she was friends with Richard Dawkins for, I think, a decade or two, rejected Islam, rejected fundamentalism, embraced the new atheism, science, reason. But a month or two ago, she announced that actually she's now converted to Christianity. And she gave various reasons for this. But one of the reasons was that she sees the threats to the West being this sort of woke revolution, which I guess is the West arguably eating itself from within, and also the threat from Islam as well. And she thinks the only thing that can equip us to deal with those threats is the Christian vision. She thinks that atheism itself is too reductionistic. Now, some people criticized her and say, well, that's not why you should become a Christian. And I think those criticisms were actually too harsh. There is more to it for her, but basically, she seemed to be saying that we need a bigger and more expansive vision, and we find that in the Christian faith.
I think that's right. I mean, to me, I don't know other faiths as well, although you can't really call it a faith, but I'm certainly a Taoist. I think that it's also compatible with Christianity to be a Buddhist. In fact, there's a book called The Tao of Christ, which is a very interesting book. It shows the parallels between these things. But I, in my experience, the mythos, and I use that word without any implication of whether it be true or false, but the mythos of Christianity is, to me, the richest one that I know in the world. It's endless in its profundity and in what it gives rise to, and not always good, of course, heaven knows. Anything that involves such frail creatures as human beings will be interpreted. Yes, will be interpreted and used by some for ends that are contrary, really, to the spirit of Christianity. But There are always the left hemisphere types in a religion who want laws, rules, procedures. And I'm right and you're wrong, and it's all written in the book here, and if it says so, that's it. Well, that is absolutely typical left hemisphere. And it's the fundamentalism that means that fundamentalist atheists and fundamentalist religious people, be they Islamic or Christian, are, you can hardly get a razor blade between them. They've got the same problem with their thinking, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, Iain, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but what an absolute privilege to have you on the show. I say your book contributed a lot to my own thinking and to my continued thinking about these cultural issues, but just about deeper life issues, indeed religious issues as well. And if you, to back up what you're saying a bit, even the person of Christ himself talks in stories. He talks in stories, and he gives sermons, stories and sermons, and he apparently knew a thing or two. So thank you so much for your time, and to our viewers and listeners, we'll be back in a week or two. But thank you, Iain.
Thanks, it's a pleasure, Luke. Thank you very much.